Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for Coffee and Conversation today. Thank you to Care One, who sponsored your delicious treats this afternoon. They're always so generous. It's very holiday appropriate into fall. We've got a really interesting and very timely presentation today. I'd like to introduce you to Professor Jon Huibregtse from Framingham State. He is going to be sharing information about a program I think you all remember, all in the family, from back in the 70s, and it's timely for today as well. So I'll hand it over to Jon. Thank you so much, Jon.
Thank you, Carrie. I'm going to take this off and hold it. We're going to be talking about All in the Family today. And just to give you, since I'm new here, none of you have seen me before. As Carrie said, I'm teaching at Framingham State. I've been there since 1997. I teach courses in American history for the most part. I've also teach Chinese history every once in a while, and I've taught Japanese history along the way as well. And my research, because I'm a professor, I got to tell you what my research is, right? I wrote a book about railroad labor during the Great Depression, and I'm also working on a biography of a guy named David Walsh, who was the first Irish Catholic governor of Massachusetts back in like 1914, 1915, and then was a senator from 1918, briefly voted out of office, and then back in office until he was voted out in 1946. So that's what I do professionally. And we're here to talk about All in the Family today, one of the most important shows, I think, in American television history. And it seems that some of the content of what's being talked about today kind of mirrors All in the Family as well, and the Archie character has become more of a common, I guess we can say, in today's culture. So anyway, All in the Family first aired on American television in January of 1971, and it was based on a British show called Death Do Us Part. And the show centered around Archie and Edith Bunker and their daughter Gloria and their son-in-law Mike Stivic. The show was revolutionary for a lot of reasons. One is the topics that it dealt with were completely revolutionary for 1971. That seems hard to believe now when, if you look at some of the sitcoms that are on now, All in the Family seems pretty tame and not all that groundbreaking. But if you think back to 1971, it was. It dealt with all kinds of controversial issues that were not dealt with at that time, and that was another reason that it was so important and such a groundbreaking show. It aired, it's hard to believe now because of the success that it had, it aired to really mixed reviews in January of 1971, and it wasn't really doing all that well until it went into summer reruns. Remember what reruns were? It went into summer reruns. And it really kicked off then in the summer of 1971, and the rest is history, as they say. In 1999, just to give you some sense of the importance of the show, TV Guide ranked Archie Bunker number 5 on its 50 greatest TV characters list of all time. And in 2005, Bravo listed him as the number 1 character of all time, beating out names that I know you'll be familiar with. See, I enjoy doing these talks because you all know what I'm talking about. And if I said Ralph Cramden to a bunch of 19-year-olds, they would just be like, huh, who's that? Lucy Ricardo, Fonzie, they wouldn't even know Fonzie. The last one, some of them might know, Homer Simpson, was also on the list, but Archie topped that list. And some of you have probably seen his chair is actually in the Smithsonian, in the American History Museum at the Smithsonian Institution. Archie's chair is there, and we'll see the chair placed kind of prominently in a clip that I'm going to play a little bit later on. So it's also important because it was the show that spun off a number of other shows that you may or may not remember. Maude was one of the spin-off shows. Good Times was one of the spin-off shows, and one of the John Amos, the dad on Good Times, just died earlier this year. The Jeffersons was another spin-off show from All in the Family, and of course Archie's Place was a spin-off that a couple of years after All in the Family, that show ran. Edith, the character of Edith, had died, and Archie ran a bar, and that was the Archie's Place. The show is also responsible for another smash TV show called MASH that I'm sure you're all familiar with. It was important for MASH for a couple of reasons. One is All in the Family kind of broke some of the barriers of dealing with real-life issues that MASH did. So that was one reason. MASH, by the way, went on the air for the first time about a year and a half after All in the Family. It started in the fall of '72. All in the Family started in the spring of '71. But beyond that, it's also important because like All in the Family, MASH, when it first came on the air, didn't do all that well. And so then CBS decided, hey, let's put MASH after All in the Family on Saturday nights. And so everybody would tune in to watch All in the Family. And back in the days before remotes, we were all too lazy to get up and switch the channels. So no channel surfing, and people just left their TV tuned to, I guess it would be Channel 4 around here. That's CBS out of Boston. So All in the Family contributed to MASH's success for that reason as well. So in 1971, when when All in the Family went on the air for the first time, think back, the world was topsy-turvy at that point. Vietnam, Watergate, civil rights, all kinds of other things. I'll delve into those a little bit more in a few minutes. But one of the things that was not topsy-turvy was American TV. American TV was about as bland and white toast as you could make it in the early 1970s. The top comedy of the previous decade was the Beverly Hillbillies, which, like all the top-rated sitcoms of that era, like Bewitched, Mayberry, RFD, Here's Lucy, and the list goes on, while they were all entertaining, they were devoid of any kind of social commentary or any kind of controversy. Going back to the original I Love Lucy show, some of you may have heard this before, but when Lucille Ball was pregnant with her first child, they didn't even want her to say the word pregnant on TV in like 1953 or 4, whenever it was. And also in the 1970s, just to give you an idea of how sort of bland it was, you remember the show The Brady Bunch? Well, if you remember that show, oftentimes it would show the couple, Mike and Carol Brady, right, in bed reading, and the kids would come in and talk to them, and like coming home from dates or whatever, and they'd come in and talk to mom and dad. And even that was controversial. Like, they didn't want to show them sitting in bed reading books. That was too risque. So that gives you an idea of how bland TV was at that time. So network officials didn't want anything controversial on the air. A few shows like the Smothers Brothers, which ran for about 3 years and got canceled in 1970, and Laugh-In, which first aired in 1968, had begun to chip away at that wall a little bit, but All in the Family really broke the wall down and created a revolution, I would say. So one example of how All in the Family broke down these barriers. This is a story from Norman Lear, who is the executive producer and creator, and he's responsible for all of those other shows I mentioned, those spin-offs as well, and other shows. He was an incredibly successful TV producer in that era. So anyway, he told this story that on one of the episodes, it was Archie and Edith's 25th wedding anniversary, so they went off to church, and Mike and Gloria were home, and they were going to plan a surprise brunch. Now, remember, they're newlyweds, and they figure out they have the house to themselves, so they go charging upstairs to their bedroom for a little while. And then they hear Archie come home because he doesn't like the minister, he doesn't like the sermon, and they hear the door, and they come charging down the steps, and they're kind of rearranging their clothing and buttoning up shirts and stuff. And Archie just stops and looks at him and says, "Really? 11:10 on a Sunday morning?" And so Lear is telling this story, and unfortunately, I looked and looked and looked for that clip, which I could not find anywhere. I'm sure it's out there. I couldn't find it. But anyway, that was an example. And so, quoting Norman Lear from the 2000 teens when he gave an interview, he said, "So we had a confrontation, and I told them if they cut it, they being network executives, I wouldn't be there the next day. An hour before the show aired, I still wasn't sure they had left it in. But I didn't think it was courageous. I was just resisting silliness. I thought, Archie can't say that line? Well, that's just silly." And so that's just one example of some of the groundbreaking material from All in the Family that I can't imagine that being on the air even 5 years or 3 years before that. So it was groundbreaking because it created this revolution. It was a catalyst for revolution. The premise of the sitcom was constructed around Archie Bunker, as most of you probably know, who was bigoted. He was an equal opportunity hater. He was bigoted towards blacks, the coloreds, as he called them, which was like borderline incorrect, politically incorrect, even in the 70s. Hispanics, commies, in air quotes, Freemasons came under his scrutiny, homosexuals, women, hippies, Jews, Asians, Catholics, women libers. One more to go because you haven't insulted Mike Stivic yet, the Polish Americans as well. And you may recall he often used an epithet to refer to Mike's Polish ancestry as well. So he was narrow-minded and at times mean to his family, which I was just chatting with someone up front before we started, was hard to watch back then, and sometimes it's hard to watch now. So he was very different than the other leading men on sitcoms in that era. When you think back to other leading men from sitcoms, men like Andy Griffith, Dick Van Dyke, Robert Young, and Hugh Beaumont, who was the dad on Leave It to Beaver, they were all kind, thoughtful, humorous. They very rarely raised their voice. They were the kind of men that all Americans wanted their sons to grow up to be and their daughters to marry, right? They were just these ideal things. They were all wonderful men. And even another leading man from that period, Gomer Pyle, while dim-witted, was at his core a lovable, decent man. Jed Clampett, same kind of thing, portrayed as sort of ignorant, and even his dim-witted nephew, Jethro, again, portrayed as very dim-witted, but at their core, they're very kind, gentle, nice men. And that was the stereotype, or that was the archetype, I guess, of TV's leading men, at least for sitcoms. All in the Family was brilliant because it delighted the bigots who always thought Archie was right on, and it delighted liberals because, in the end, usually Mike and Gloria and the liberal message would win out over Archie. He would always get his comeuppance. And in fact, Lear said he got a lot of mail from people, who wrote saying, "Why does Archie always come out looking bad in this? I agree with him, and you always let Stivic win. Why are you doing this?" So clearly, the show's message was lost on some people who were watching it. It was a brilliant show because much of the humor was conveyed by the great acting. If you just were able to read a script, they're not setting up jokes like a lot of TV shows do now. You know, you watch some sitcoms now, and 3 lines before the punchline, you know what they're going to say, or you have a good idea of what they're going to say. All in the Family wasn't like that. The thing that made it so funny and brilliant was really the acting of Carol O'Connor, who played Archie Bunker, Gene Stapleton, who played Edith Bunker, Gloria Stivic was played by Sally Struthers, and Rob Reiner was Mike Stivic. Those were the four main characters. And here's a fun fact, just in case, parenthetically to all of this, in case you're playing bar trivia and this ever comes up. The producers originally asked Mickey Rooney to play Archie Bunker. And Mickey Rooney turned it down, said he thought the part was un-American and didn't want anything to do with it. So anyway, I don't know if that will ever come up, but if it does, you're armed with that trivial knowledge right now. So it was conveyed by this wonderful acting. The script wasn't that funny in just its words, but when it was brought to life in front of a studio audience, it was funny. And the way they filmed the show in front of the studio audience is they would rehearse all week, and then Friday night they would go and they would tape it twice in front of a live audience with an hour or so in between the two shows. And in between, if a joke didn't work, if something just didn't feel right, they would tinker with it and do something a little bit different. But then the editors would go in and take those two episodes and splice them together to make the show that we all watched on Saturday night. That was the production process. So it was the brilliant chemistry between the four leading actors on the show that really was critical to its success. By taking subjects and language that had long been taboo on television and bringing it into the open, it helped TV gain a certain credibility that it didn't have up until that point. People recognized the kind of sterile nature of much of what was on TV. Some of these issues had been attacked or dealt with in movies for a long time, but never on television. Some of the movies that come to mind, some of my favorites, I'm an old movie buff, movies like The Best Years of Our Lives, which was 1946, starring Myrna Loy and Frederick March. And it dealt with the struggles of World War II veterans coming home. And actually one of the main characters in that movie was from the Boston area who had lost both hands in the war, and he was one of the stars of that movie with two hooks to replace his lost hands. Another movie called Gentleman's Agreement in 1947 with Gregory Peck and Dorothy Lamour. In that movie, Gregory Peck, who was not Jewish, played a Jewish or pretended to be Jewish to highlight discrimination against Jewish people. And at one point, I forget the name he takes on, but he goes to a resort and tells them his name, which is a quote-unquote Jewish name, and the people at the resort hem and haw, and they're trying not to give him a room and all of this stuff. That was Gentleman's Agreement. And then the last movie that I'd mention that takes on some of these issues is a movie called Storm Center in 1956, starring Betty Davis and Brian Keith. And in that movie, Betty Davis plays a librarian who refuses to take, it's been a while since I watched the movie, I think it's the Communist Manifesto off of the shelf in the library. And Brian Keith is like head of the library board, and he fires her for not removing this book from the shelf that they want removed. And it was 1956, so it was clearly a comment on McCarthyism of the era. But television had never done that. Television had never gone out on a limb, so to speak, to deal with those kinds of issues. But All in the Family changed all that. It dealt with alcoholism. It dealt with drugs. It dealt with racism. It dealt with Edith going through menopause. It dealt with homosexuality. It dealt with breast cancer, and it dealt with rape in very human ways, not just sort of abstract. Calls to rape counseling centers went up after that show aired. Queries about breast cancer also rose after those episodes aired. And it made talking about these issues that had previously been taboo in public society, or in public spaces, I guess we could say, more acceptable. And it was happening on TV, so it must be okay to happen in other people's living rooms as well. Some have argued, with good reason, that All in the Family made bigotry more palatable to the bigots, as well as the rest of the audience, so that its success was somewhat tainted. And you can't deny that Archie was a bigot. While many people would agree with his views on race, while many people didn't agree with his views on race, I think everybody could agree or understand the angst that Archie felt. And that was a big part of the character, was the angst that Archie felt with the world changing so rapidly around him. And he felt, I think, out of control, or he didn't have control. And that's a big part of Archie's character, and I think that's one of the things that makes it relevant to what's going on today as well with our political situation such as it is. So Americans, real and fictional, were apprehensive about the fast-changing world that they didn't understand and seemed so far and distant from the world that they had grown up in. The early 1970s were an incredibly tumultuous time that left many Americans and the fictional Archie Bunker frustrated and concerned. The Vietnam War was coming to an end. Troop withdrawals that had begun in 1969, but they were moving far too slowly for a lot of people. Draft riots and draft protests were on the uptick. And then in the spring of 1970, the U.S. invaded neutral Cambodia, which led to not only escalating the war, but the murders of students at Kent State in Ohio and Jackson State in Mississippi. So Vietnam was an incredibly divisive issue, and in fact, the first clip we're going to see, we see Vietnam being a divisive issue between Mike and Archie. A later episode also dealt with Mike's friend who went to Canada to avoid the draft. We'll see that clip as well in a few minutes. The Watergate scandal was about to break about a year after All in the Family aired. Watergate began in June of 1972 is when the burglary happened and of course consumed the country for the next 18 months not more than 18 months, 2 years, more like 25 or 26 months, until Nixon finally resigned in August of 1974. And beyond that, the economy was beginning to stagnate. I'm sure I don't have to tell you about the economy of the 1970s. Most of the decade was in recession. Again, parenthetically, a while ago I saw a 20-something influencer, whatever that is these days, on social media saying that all of us baby boomers don't know anything about inflation because you never had to deal with it. And I told that to my sister, who purchased her first home in like 1977, and she said, "Oh yeah, 12% on our mortgage, right? That's not inflation." But anyway, Americans in the 70s, when All in the Family was first airing, are dealing with a sustained economic decline that goes on throughout the 1970s. The first oil embargo was in 1973, another oil embargo in 1979. Inflation ran at double digits most of the decade. Economists or newspaper reporters, I'm not sure who, came out with something called the Misery Index, which was a combination of unemployment and inflation. So the economy was stagnating, and that plays out in Archie, in the show many times. Archie had a job at the loading docks. Don't really know exactly what he does, but it's always the loading docks. But in later episodes, he got a job as a cabbie, just as a sidelight. He tended bar occasionally down at the bar that he eventually buys in the show, and that's Archie's place. He's concerned about strikes happening and trying to avoid strikes because he doesn't want to lose his paycheck. So he is concerned about the economy, or concerned about, rephrase that, I'm sorry. He is concerned about the economy because of inflation, because he feels threatened about his job, and so he goes out and finds these second jobs to earn extra money along the way. And in one of the episodes also is about Edith working outside the home, and of course he's not pleased about that either. And we'll see a funny clip about that as well in a little bit. And then finally, there is the civil rights movement that had been percolating for a long, long time. One of the classes I teach is on the civil rights movement, so I could take us back to 1865 on this one if we wanted to, but I won't go back that far. But the 1950s and 60s, the civil rights movement, African Americans, of course, are protesting and gaining civil rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were only a few years old when All in the Family aired. The riots of the 1960s in a lot of urban America, Detroit, Los Angeles, Chicago, nearly all over the country, most big cities. Riots. Martin Luther King had been assassinated only about 3 years before All in the Family aired for the first time, April of '68. A few years before that, of course, Malcolm X had been assassinated in 1965. So these changes are, the repercussions are being felt throughout American culture. In addition, the 1970s were the end of a period in American history called the Great Migration, which was when African Americans moved out of the South to the North and the West, beginning in World War I when European immigration was cut off and African Americans moved north to take those jobs. And I recommend a book called The Warmth of a Different Sun if anybody is interested in the Great Migration, by a woman whose name is escaping me right now, which is, I'm sorry about that. But if you're interested, it's called Warmth of a Different Sun, and it's about the Great Migration. It's excellent book. And in addition to African American civil rights, there's the women's liberation movement is in full swing. If I'm invited back, a possible talk would be the influence of another television show from the 1970s called The Mary Tyler Moore Show, which was incredibly influential. Mary was, a single professional woman. She wasn't really looking to go out on a date or get married. If that happened, that was fine, but that wasn't the gist of the show. And she's dealing with men on equal ground, equal terms, and it sounds pretty bland, I guess, for today, but in 1974 or 5, when that aired, that was really pretty revolutionary. So there's the women's liberation movement. Just about 6 months before our All in the Family aired for the first time was the first gay pride parade in New York City in the summer of 1970. That was on the 1-year anniversary of the Stonewall riots, which are this event. Stonewall was a bar in Greenwich Village. It was a gay bar that got raided by the police. Riots broke out, lots of protests around it, and a year later, to celebrate or to commemorate the Stonewall riots is when the gay pride parade started, and of course they're still going on today now, 56, whatever years later. So the civil rights movement was also percolating through the show, through culture, and all of America was really kind of figuring out how to come to grips with all of this. And All in the Family captured that angst quite well. There's a long list of firsts for African Americans, women, and LGBTQ plus community in the 1970s that too long to go into, but there were a lot of firsts for women, for all of those groups in the 1970s. So all of this is going on, and Archie was struggling mightily to figure out what the heck was going on and how his world, which to him seemed totally upside down, right? How he was going to survive in that period. So in the 1950s, when Thurgood Marshall, the attorney for the NAACP, who argued the Brown case before the Supreme Court, when people were telling him that you should go slow, use caution, he said, "We've waited 80 years, isn't that long enough?" One of his more famous quotes. And by the 1970s, African Americans and others had been waiting even longer, and that frustration was much more palatable in the 1970s, and much of the show revolved around those kinds of issues. In one episode, for instance, Archie tries to prevent the Jeffersons from moving in next door. The Jeffersons, you may recall George and Wheezy, African-American couple, and didn't want them to move in. And what was ironic, I guess, was that in some ways George was everything that Archie wanted to be, because George was a successful businessman. He had plenty of money. He ran several dry cleaning businesses. He was franchising dry cleaning places throughout New York City. So that was just, I suppose, by Norman Lear, just a little, poke at everybody to have this successful black businessman living next door to Archie. And if you remember the spin-off show called The Jeffersons, the theme song of that show was "Moving On Up to the East Side," and it was all about how we're leaving, trashy Queens behind, and we're moving on up. And a lot of the shows centered around that conflict between Archie and George Jefferson, Archie and Lionel, the son of the Jeffersons, who is also one of the main characters. And then in a later episode, Archie and George team up to try to prevent Puerto Ricans from moving into the neighborhood. So this sort of bigotry runs throughout the episode or throughout the series. And one of the things that I think was brilliant about the George Jefferson character is, yes, he's successful, but in his own way, he's just as bigoted as Archie is. He's just as racist as Archie is, but just because he's black, the racism is aimed at different people. So in one episode, Archie, also one of the most famous clips from the show, which I will show you in a little bit here, is that Sammy Davis visited his house. Sammy Davis Jr. as himself came to the Bunker household because Archie had been driving a cab and he'd left his briefcase in the cab, and he had to come to Archie's house to pick up the briefcase. And I will show that clip as well. So to conclude my talk, and then I've got about 4 clips that are 3 to 5 minutes long. So I have many skills, but editing YouTube clips that I've downloaded to the exact length I wanted is not one of them. So bear with me in a few moments. But to conclude my talk, in an interview, Carol O'Connor, who played Archie Bunker, summed up Archie in this way. And this is a little bit of a long quote. I apologize, but I'm going to read the quote. He said, "Archie's dilemma is coping with a world that is changing in front of him. He does not know what to do except to lose his temper, mouth his poisons, look elsewhere to fix the blame for his own discomfort. But he won't get to the root of his problem, because the root of the problem is himself, and he doesn't know it. That's the dilemma of Archie Bunker." And I thought that summed up Archie very well. I think we can all emphasize with Archie, Edith, Gloria, and Mike, because they were caught up in a world that at times made no sense to them at all anymore. And especially that's true of Archie. They dealt with real problems, not always with humor per se, but in ways that the audience understood was how real people actually dealt with problems. This wasn't like Ricky and Lucy dealing with problems, or the Cleavers on Leave It to Beaver. Finally, Archie's love for Edith and his family always trumped his bigotry, as in one episode where he mistakenly joins a group called the Queen's Crusaders. Queen spelled with a K, so you can get the gist. He doesn't realize this is, some version of the KKK. He just thinks it's a civic organization, and so he joins, and then he realizes that they want to burn a cross on Mike and Gloria's front yard. And this was later in the show when Mike and Gloria had moved next door into actually what had been the Jeffersons' house on the show. So Archie gets them to, gets the Queen's Crusaders, that is, to not burn the cross on Mike and Gloria's front yard. And then in another episode, we see Archie's humanity when his good friend Stretch Cunningham, a name, if you watch the show, you might remember. You don't see him a lot, but Archie's always talking about Stretch Cunningham. And Stretch dies, and Archie is asked to give a eulogy, and only then does he learn that Stretch Cunningham is Jewish. But he goes through with the eulogy. He wears a yarmulke, to deliver the eulogy, and at the end of his eulogy looks right into the camera and in a very heartfelt way says shalom into the camera, and the show ends on that note with Archie saying shalom into the camera. So that is the end of my prepared talk about All in the Family. So are there any questions I can try to answer? Yes.
It's not a question, but does everyone realize this show, All in the Family, is on every Sunday night on MeTV for 2 hours?
No, I was not aware of that. So MeTV every Sunday night for 2 hours. 8 to 10. Okay. I'll have to tune in. Other questions, comments, anything?
Don't you think that the writers of All in the Family were also very brilliant?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. No question about it. The other thing I was thinking of when I was watching the clip of Edith losing her temper there is having to do that twice in one night. That must have taken a lot of energy, and then to get to go and do it again. That's why she's won all kinds of Emmy awards for her acting, I guess.
Just as funny as Till Death Do Us Part.
Yes. She says, just as funny as Till Death Do Us Part, the British show that this was based on. Other questions, comments, observations? Anybody? Oh, one more?
Well, it isn't a question. I remember there was another episode when Edith had finally told Archie to stifle, and he.
Oh yeah, because I don't think we heard him say that, but he'd always tell her to stifle, and usually stifle dingbat. And at some point she got really angry with him and told him to stifle. Stifle Archie, yelled it at him, which was another classic scene. Yeah, absolutely. There are so many that, in a show that ran for 9 years, there are so many clips that could be used to illustrate some of what the show was all about. So, anything else? All right. Thank you very much.